Hello, everybody. It is July 26th, 2026, here in the United States of America. I hope everyone out there is having a fantastic weekend and a very blessed Sunday. Sunday, the Lord's Day. In this video, though, I'd like to talk a little bit about Taiwan, actually. Not much has changed in the last few days with the war in Iran. The continued trading of strikes seems to be the norm. The United States hits targets in Iran. Iran fires back at U.S. assets in the region, as well as infrastructure within Middle Eastern countries that host U.S. bases. Rinse and repeat. This seems to be the norm for at least some time until something changes or there is a significant escalation in the war. And as far as Ukraine goes, not many changes in the last few days. Keeping an eye out on the Donbass and for the inevitable offensive against Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, whenever that may be. But anyways, let's talk a little bit about the situation in the Pacific. And one of the reasons why I'd like to talk about Taiwan is because this strategy that the United States seems to have around arming Taiwan and keeping it as some kind of armed camp of resistance right off the coast of China just doesn't seem to be a viable long-term strategy for several reasons, at least in my estimation. First and foremost, I would like to say that I think one way or the other, inevitably Taiwan will become part of China again, although I don't think this is actually going to happen through military means. The Chinese government and Chinese intelligence agencies have a very vested interest in making sure that pro-Chinese and pro-reconciliation political parties come to power eventually within Taiwan. I think this will eventually happen. The United States, on the other hand, is also funding and assisting the political parties in Taiwan that are pro-West, pro-U.S., and pro-independence from China. I am not of the opinion that there is some kind of looming offensive about to take place to actually take Taiwan for many reasons on either side, really. I don't think there's any serious plans that the U.S. would have to actually hold the island in the unlikely event that the Chinese actually do try to take it. I think our Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, was correct in his assertion that, well, it wasn't really an assertion, it was just stating a fact that every single war game run involving this scenario ended in a U.S. defeat in the region. But hypothetically, if that were to happen, let's talk about why it would be so difficult for the U.S. to actually defend Taiwan if the Chinese, and that's if, they resolve themselves to using military force to actually take Taiwan. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I don't think this is likely. I think the Chinese are content to play the long game and to wait for a favorable political scenario to present itself within Taiwan to allow for a fairly peaceful and bloodless reunification. Because even if China were to move on Taiwan militarily, I think the casualties would be enormous for China, even though I think the math clearly suggests that they would likely win this conflict. The cost of doing so would be something that I'm not sure China views worth paying if simple patience will give them the result that they desire. So anyways, let's talk about Taiwan. So Taiwan is actually situated very close to mainland China, for those that might not be aware. It's only around 121 miles from Putain, however you pronounce that Chinese city. I'm not good at Chinese pronunciations, please forgive me. So let's do some measurements here. Okay, let's select a point right here, and let's go to the coast of Taiwan. Okay, we're actually looking at 110 miles in this region. It's not very far. It's actually very close and firmly within range of ballistic missiles, both hypersonic and supersonic ballistic missiles. And this is not a very large area to cover. If you were to move troops from A to B, relatively speaking. Now, the United States, on the other hand, if it needed to actually use ground troops to defend Taiwan, we are talking about a very, very long distance for logistics. Let's just see here. How far actually is it from the coast of Taiwan to the U.S. mainland? Now, yes, the U.S. has bases in the Pacific. They have bases in Japan. They have a base in Okinawa, which is right here, fairly close to Taiwan. They have bases in South Korea. So they have assets within the region. But the amount of ground assets they would need to defend Taiwan is really the concern here. Yes, air assets are fairly easy to move. You can fly from A to B. You can bring in carriers, and those planes can be launched from carriers. But ground troops require like physical transportation. Yes, you can bring in some by air, but the amount of ground troops you would actually need to defend Taiwan would require a fairly large armada of ships, ships that we just haven't had since World War II. Now, I think people don't really realize the scale of the war in the Pacific. Iwo Jima, for example, when Iwo Jima was taken, and this was this is a very small island in the Pacific, relatively speaking, right here. Very tiny, not very large. Let's see how wide is. Almost 3 miles at its widest points. A little under 3 miles, I think, if my math is mathing, which oftentimes it's not. The Japanese had several thousand troops garrisoned here, and the United States rolled up with a fleet of several hundred ships. It was a very large fleet. I forget the exact number, but it was quite a few ships, logistics, ships specializing in logistics, carrying troops, supplies, ammunition, armored vehicles. You had destroyers, you had battleships, you had carriers, all around this small island because it had several thousand very well dug in Japanese defenders. Okay. As you can see, Taiwan is much, much, much larger. This would require a presence of tens of thousands of U.S. troops, if not more, to adequately defend it from the ground. And, if it took that many ships to significantly, to bring an offensive force significant enough to take Iwo Jima, well, how many ships do you need for logistics, supplies, troop transport, offensive action? How many would you need to launch some kind of operation to defend Taiwan? And as good as the United States Navy is, I think without question, the United States Navy is still the best Navy in the world. Is it capable at this point to launch and maintain some kind of operation like that? Given the size of our military and the current size of our Navy, yes, it is, I believe, the largest Navy in the world. We have, I think, 10 aircraft carriers currently in service. We have hundreds of ships. We do have plenty of ships dedicated to things like logistics and supply transport, troop transport, things of that sort. But the scale of this conflict would be something that we haven't fought since World War II, and I don't think we've been prepared to fight since World War II. So the distance alone here of keeping Taiwan supplied enough to be defended adequately overseas to bring things that are manufactured in the heartland of the United States. Oopsie. Let's, okay, reset the north. Yeah, there we go. to bring things that are manufactured here to here, to here is a very difficult undertaking, very difficult indeed. Again, as I mentioned before, the sizes of the forces used in the Pacific War are something that I don't really think we can actually fathom today. We really can't. Our Navy during the Pacific War was an unstoppable juggernaut, fighting against the Navy that itself at one point seemed like an unstoppable juggernaut, but just didn't have the logistics to really, the logistics and resources to maintain itself like the United States had at the time. Our production capability back then seemed to be much more efficient, much better, much more geared toward domestic mass production than it is now. I feel like in many ways our industrial capability has somewhat lessened in recent years due to quite a few factors I really won't talk about here. But let's go back to this. So just getting troops from A to B across the entire Pacific to Taiwan to adequately defend it would be difficult. Like I said, we don't have enough troops stationed in the region to actually defend the island itself. Okay, so let's talk about just supplying the Taiwanese with weapons and ammunition and things like that. Well, you still have to get them from A to B. That's a long distance to cover, and the truth is, this is all within range of Chinese drones and ballistic missiles, this entire region. And these weapons can be safely launched from mainland China, any of these provinces, or even further back. Because you got to keep in mind, these hypersonic ballistic missiles have quite the range on them, and so do the supersonic ballistic missiles. What is the range of, I probably should have looked this up. I don't know it offhand. Give me 1 second here, actually. Bear with me. I should have had this information ready, but I didn't. I'm sorry. Well, the average range span for Chinese ballistic missiles, we're talking 300 miles to up to 15,000. Well, those are intercontinental ballistic missiles, but short range, we're talking 300 to about 1,000 kilometers. Medium range, we're talking 1,000 kilometers to 3,000 kilometers. Intermediate range, 3,000 to 5,500. Intercontinental, well, we'll just assume that China's not going to be launching nukes, hopefully. But anyways, yes, this area is pretty firmly covered within the range of Chinese ballistic missiles, which means that approaching ships are well within the range of being struck by Chinese ballistic missiles. Now, I will say this, though. China would have a very, very difficult time landing on Taiwan without taking large amounts of casualties. Yes, this is only 100 miles here. But you also have to assume, too, that Taiwan is going to be armed to the teeth with American weaponry. Much of that weaponry will be located in regions that are very hard for the Chinese to hit. The Taiwanese aren't stupid. Look how rugged the interior of Taiwan is. How many places here could you hide launch sites for both drones and ballistic missiles? There are lots of places. And I'm sure the Taiwanese have adequately prepared for this over the years. So yes, the Chinese only have to cross about 100 miles of sea to land troops physically on Taiwan, but they will be under plenty of fire the entire time. But one advantage the Chinese do have here, if they were to land and somehow maintain a foothold on Taiwan, is the short amount of travel for logistics for the Chinese. And the Chinese can also hold this area pretty firmly from American subs to actually get in. I'm sure American ballistic missiles could target this region to attack Chinese logistics, but those would have to be launched from launch sites that are also well within range of Chinese counterstrikes. South Korea, Japan, Okinawa. Any of these regions are in range of Chinese ballistic missiles and or aircraft. So whatever the Americans use to hit the Chinese with, the Chinese will hit back in kind in those regions fairly quickly. So say the American Pacific Fleet brings up its aircraft carriers. Its aircraft carriers have to get within range of the Chinese mainland to actually, or well, to Taiwan to launch sorties against either approaching Chinese ships or Chinese aircraft. Now, the big issue here is the American Navy is heavily dependent on aircraft carriers. Like, that is the key component of the U.S. Navy. It is how we project our power across the world. Now, the U.S. aircraft carriers were considered to be unassailable for the longest time. But now with the advent of hypersonic ballistic missiles that are nearly impossible to reliably intercept, that kind of changes the game. One of those missiles, if not several, could probably take out in a single aircraft carrier fairly quickly, or heavily damage it enough to where it can no longer be in theater. Now, so much money is actually invested into these super carriers. We're talking billions of dollars. What happens if one of them goes down? What kind of psychological blow is that to the United States if it loses a super carrier? These things take years to build. And as I mentioned before, this isn't World War II where we can turn out ships in like a year or two. Okay, these aircraft carriers are enormous, complex engines of war that take years of planning to build and produce. They cannot be replaced quickly. If, say, the United States were to lose 2 or 3 in quick succession because of Chinese hypersonic missiles, then what? What happens then? That's the question that everybody's asking. And again, I'm not trashing the U.S. Navy here, but we need to be honest. Like, these hypersonic missiles and drones, for that matter, are like this great force equalizer that we've seen recently, especially in Ukraine. Ukraine has been able to slow the Russian advance substantially across Ukraine due to drone warfare. Drones make it very difficult for a superior force to achieve objectives, just for the fact that, leaving hypersonic and ballistic missiles aside, drones make it very difficult to move large amounts of forces up to any adequate distance away from the target that needs to be struck. It makes it very difficult to concentrate armored formations. It makes it very difficult to have like dense troop concentrations in any part of the line. So like an inferior force could technically hold back a much superior force simply with the use of drones. Now, are drones the ultimate linchpin to defeat a superior military? No, it's part of a combined arms effort, but drones do seem to be a great force equalizer in today's conflicts. And yes, while the United States has a much superior Navy, I would say, to the Chinese at this moment, drones and ballistic missiles, I think, kind of negate those advantages. And also, too, the proximity that Taiwan has to the coast of China makes things very difficult. And I think that's really what this war all comes down to, is proximity. Taiwan is not in the middle of the Pacific. It's 100 miles off the coast of mainland China. China can station their ballistic missile launch sites anywhere within this region of China. And to actually neutralize them, the United States would need to launch air sorties or ballistic missile strikes against mainland China. And the amount of missiles the United States would need to effectively neutralize launchers would be something that I frankly think we just don't have. Even aircraft, I'm sure aircraft would probably suffer substantial losses. One of the reasons why aircraft don't fly freely, and this goes for both sides over Ukraine, is the amount of air defense near the front line. Now, while I would say Ukraine's air defense is somewhat lessened, it's still relatively difficult for the Russians to get aircraft close to the front lines or over the front lines because they're under the constant threat of being shot down by manpads and other air defense systems. And same thing goes with Russia. It's very difficult for the Ukrainians to get aircraft close to the front lines or over any part of Russia because air defense networks are so thick. You would have to assume that the Chinese would offer the same kind of defense against air power that the Russians and Ukrainians have against each other, because you got to keep in mind they are studying this conflict very closely. Everybody should be. Any great power should be studying the way that wars will be fought in the 21st century. So one would have to assume that Chinese air defense would be significant and thick, even against B-2s. But people need to realize too that B-2s aren't mass produced. There's only 20 of them, I believe. So what happens if you lose 2 or 3? Okay. There's only 144 F-22s. What happens if you lose several of those? And that's kind of, I think, the unfortunate turn the U.S. military has taken. During World War II, we definitely believed in quantity over quality. Yes, we made great things, but we also were realistic about being able to mass produce the weapons that we had. It seems that our mindset today is to lean on our technological edge over all else. We dump enormous amounts of money into these projects that only produce a handful of weapons, and those weapons are hard to manufacture in large numbers. The Chinese don't have that issue. The Chinese will manufacture huge amounts of weapons that might just work okay, but good enough to get the job done, and be perfectly content with that. We, on the other hand, have a different philosophy when it comes to warfare. And I think if the leadership of the U.S. intelligence was smart, which I hope they are, that we would switch over to making cheaper, more easily mass-produced things if we do intend on actually getting into some kind of major conflict with China, because they will outproduce us 1,000,000 to 1 on things, because they don't care so much about quality as they do about quantity. And keep in mind, if anybody studied World War II, what won that war? Quality or quantity? It was quantity that won that war, hands down. And the Chinese know this. So that's another difficult thing too. The distance across the Pacific presents a problem. The proximity of Taiwan to mainland China presents a problem. And the fact that U.S. bases are firmly within counterstrike range of the Chinese. And I'm sure those bases would be hit very, very quickly. And if the air power in those bases is neutralized, well, then what? Now, that being said, this operation, I'm sure, would be very costly to China itself, and also runs the risk of escalating into nuclear war. And as I mentioned before, if the Chinese were to physically land on Taiwan after neutralizing all local defenses at sea to their liking, they are still likely to suffer some pretty significant casualties because of the terrain of Taiwan itself. But the proximity of Taiwan and to Chinese weapon systems makes U.S. Navy assets in the region very vulnerable. Okay. I think ultimately, yes, if this were to take place, the Chinese would suffer very heavy casualties and eventually would prevail, but it would probably be something of a Pyrrhic victory, and Taiwan would likely be destroyed in the process. So what would there be left for the Chinese to have after? Would it be worth it to the Chinese to do this just to bring Taiwan back into the fold, back into mainland China? So I think this entire scenario is fairly unlikely, but if it were to play out, this is how I think it would play out. It's extremely risky for the U.S. Navy and the U.S. military to defend Taiwan because of its proximity to China. I think it's a losing endeavor. It seems to be that most war games run by the Pentagon agree with this assessment. Our own Secretary of War agrees with this assessment. So we are content to settle for, I believe, deterrence for now, to arm Taiwan enough to make the Chinese think twice about ever trying to physically take it. But I think the Chinese are patient enough to play the political long game where they eventually will have Taiwan back in the fold through political means. But for the time being, the U.S. would like Taiwan to remain independent because the U.S. wants to keep China contained to the waters immediately around China, the East China Sea, because the United States has dominion over the entire Pacific, and that was, the spoils of war we received at the end of World War II. Once the Japanese Empire was defeated, the United States' backyard became the Pacific Ocean and has stayed that way ever since. This is our territory, this is our domain, and we would like to keep it that way. And ultimately, that's why the United States and the Chinese or Japanese fought in World War II. It wasn't over any great moral cause. It was over who gets to control the Pacific. It was always going to be one or the other, and the U.S. being chiefly a naval and mercantile power was always going to spread further and further into the Pacific and come to blows with the Empire of Japan, and seems to be in a position where a war with China is a real is a possibility. I wouldn't say it's an extremely realistic possibility at this moment, but it is something that could happen because the Chinese are the United States' chief rival on the world stage. There's three main great powers in this world. It's the United States, China, and Russia, in that order. The United States currently is the most powerful. China is becoming a closer and closer second, and the third is Russia, largely because of its massive nuclear arsenal and very advanced delivery systems, such as the Orezhnik and their arsenal of hypersonic missiles, and the experience now that their military has actually engaging in 21st century warfare. So I think for the three to have an adversarial relationship is an inevitability, and it seems that much of the adversarial relationship with China is centered around keeping China contained to the East China Sea, and Taiwan seems to be the linchpin for that containment, and also because Taiwan produces large amounts of chips that the U.S. needs for its technology. But anyways, that's really all I wanted to talk about in this video. That's my view on a potential conflict between the two countries. Just to sum things up, the proximity to Taiwan, to China, makes it extremely difficult for the U.S. to actually defend Taiwan and to bring its assets close enough to the theater to be used effectively, its naval assets. And it makes it very difficult to physically land troops on Taiwan because of the massive distance between U.S. assets, specifically on the mainland U.S., and Taiwan, versus how close mainland China is to Taiwan, and how Taiwan is completely within the umbrella of Chinese hypersonic and supersonic ballistic missiles. I think that is what makes it so difficult. Now, if this was an island in the middle of the Pacific, I would say yes, the U.S. has the uncontested advantage over taking and holding that island. But because this is right off the coast of China, many of the advantages that the U.S. would have in any kind of engagement involving its Navy is neutralized by the fact that there are so many ballistic missiles stationed on China with the ability to strike U.S. naval assets. But anyways, that's really all I wanted to talk about in this video today. I'm just going to keep an eye on what's happening in Iran and Ukraine, and I will be back Monday with more content. No, actually Tuesday. I'm taking tomorrow off. I'm going to do a video roughly every 2 days. I was supposed to do this video last night. I had some things going on and didn't have a chance to, so I did it today. So I'll be back Tuesday. Anyways, I hope everyone out there has a fantastic day. If you enjoyed this content, if you enjoyed what I'm doing, please subscribe to my channel, hit the like button. And if you're also, if you're subscribed to this channel already, please make sure the bell notification is still turned on so you get notifications when I do post a video. YouTube isn't so great at making sure those stay on. But anyways, I hope everyone out there has a fantastic day, and until next time.